Hi, everyone. Welcome to Vilnius.js September Meetup. I'm so glad to see all these faces here since we didn't have a meetup for a while. Who remembers the last meetup, live meetup, where the actual people came? Yeah. How long? A long time ago, right? Okay, so welcome everyone. Also welcome people who are online. Safety first, please. The ones who are sitting here, wear your masks as much as possible, except if you are eating or drinking. But it's for all our safety. The meetup agenda is pretty straightforward. We're having a talk, and then it's going to be followed by the Q&A session. So please hold on with your questions. And for the ones who are online, please post them in the chat. I'm going to read them out loud later on. And the ones who are in here, you will be able to simply just raise your hand and say the question. Yeah, and the most important part, today we have the one and only C.Dodds, who flew here from the US, and it's a very special guest, very known person in the frontend community. Probably, how many of you watched any courses of Kent? Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah, I don't need to introduce him, I guess. Cool. So Kent is will be giving a talk today about the testing, in particular, how to know what to test. And I guess that's it. We can start. Last thing, big thanks for the Wix Engineering for making this happen. And Kent, let's start.
All right. Yes, thank you, Wix Engineering. Okay, how do I make this thing go away? Nope, that is not what that does. All right, well, I think maybe if I click that and then make it, I don't know, we'll see. Okay, yes, this is a picture of myself. So yes, my name is Kent C.Dodds, and I'm going to talk about how to know what to test. That was one of the, I guess, an email was sent out, and most people seemed interested in this topic. This link is wrong. Whoops, my bad. Hold on, let me grab the correct link really quick. I knew I messed that up. It's that. There you go. If you want to find these slides, you can get it there. And oh yeah, this is the wrong blog post too. I'll fix that later. Just Google how to know what to test. Yeah, I'm probably now I'm curious. Either Google it or DuckDuckGo it. That's what I do. Uh-oh. I'm not even on the first page. Well, I need somebody to link to it or something. I don't know how to do that stuff. Oh, yeah, spoiler alert. I'll just share this really quick. This is my new website that is coming next week. It is hosted somewhere, but I'm showing you local so that you don't like tweet out where it's hosted. Eventually, it'll be at kentcdodds.com. Which currently is this thing, which is nice, but this is way better. Watch this. And it has a dark mode. Look at that. Ah, finally, people will stop asking me about that. And we have user accounts. So that's awesome. Anyway, so many exciting things. I can't wait. And this is built in Remix. And it is 100% server rendered. And in fact, every page has stuff that's unique to the user on it as well. And it's still lightning fast. So have fun with that static site generation, or as I lovingly refer to it as spinner site generation. Yes, I am super excited about this. So stay tuned because kentcdodds.com is going to look awesome next week. Okay, but we're here to talk about knowing what to test. And yeah, how many of you have 100% code coverage on your tests in your app? Good. You shouldn't. Unless you're building a library that's like, a set of components or something, in which case having 100% code coverage makes a lot of sense there. But for your apps, no, 100% code coverage is not a good target. You'll end up doing a lot of weird things in your tests and wasting so much time that you could be spending making your product better. So if it's not just test all of the things and do 100% code coverage, then we have to decide what we're going to test. So that's what we're going to talk about. So how many of you have done testingjavascript.com? That's my testing course. Okay, just a handful of you. Most of you are Epic React people. That's great too. So testingjavascript.com, and actually Epic React has a testing workshop as well. It teaches us how to test, but I don't talk a whole lot about, well, I do sort of, yeah, but we're going to talk about what to test, how to decide what to prioritize testing. And I normally in all of my talks, I say what this talk is and what this talk isn't. And I couldn't think about what this talk isn't. I think it's pretty clear what it is. So if you have some expectations and by the end of the talk, those expectations are not met, let me know what your expectations were and I'll put them in what this talk isn't. Okay, so this is a tweet I tweeted a few years ago. The more confident, or the more your tests resemble the way your software is used, the more confidence they can give you. A few months before tweeting that, I actually wrote the inverse. The less your tests resemble the way your software used, the less confidence they can give you. And that just sounded so negative. So I tweeted this one instead. And I stand by this super hard. I feel like we're trying to write we're trying to make sure that when our software is used, it's going to work. And the best way we can do that is by testing the way that our software is going to be used. It seems very self-evident, but at the time that I tweeted this is actually not the way that most people were writing tests. How many of you are using React Testing Library? Yeah, that is a victory. I wrote React Testing Library, in case you didn't know. And hopefully you're happy with it. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand if you're not happy with it. So we write tests to be confident that our application will work when the user uses them. That's the entire reason. Now, some of you might write tests to help you design the API or to help you iterate, on building the feature, and that's great. But the reason that we run our tests in CI and like before we deploy is so that we can be confident we didn't break anything. Okay, and so for me, when I'm thinking about tests, those are the types of tests that I'm talking about. Feel free to do your test-driven development and all that stuff. And some of those tests that you write in that process can be used in CI to give you confidence, and often that's the case. But what we really want is to just be confident that we can ship without manually having to check everything. That's the entire purpose of writing tests. So what I'm going to give you the key takeaway right here at the beginning. If you remember nothing else from this talk, this is what you should remember. Be a nice person. No, just kidding. I mean, do that too, but this is the key takeaway. Think less about the code you're testing, more about the use cases the code supports. And that's how you decide what to test. You think about the use cases. And if you're thinking about the code and you're just looking at this code and you're thinking, okay, I need to test this code, it's very easy to slip into testing implementation details. And I'm not going to go too far into that unless somebody asks about it in the Q&A. But I do have a blog post about that you can look at. So it's great to think about the code and to think, okay, this code needs to be tested, but it's way more important to think about the use cases because the code changes more often than the use cases do. And the code can be working, but the use case is broken. I'm going to give an example because like this might not be super clear until we get to that example. So yeah, you can't see that. Let me just yeah, I think that's better. Okay, so because it's more important to think about the use cases in the code, then our code coverage, as great as it is not as good as use case coverage. The problem is there's no quantifiable metric for use case coverage. There's no way to like measure that. And so what gets measured is what gets, there's a phrase, what gets measured is what gets prioritized or whatever. And so because code coverage is what we can measure, that's what we prioritize, but we really should be thinking about use cases because code coverage all that it tells us is this line of code or this branch of the if statement or ternary or switch was run or was not run when the tests were run. That is everything in that it can tell you. It can tell you no more than that. And what that means is it cannot tell you whether that code is satisfying the use case for its creation, like whether it is at all useful. And also, like it can't tell us whether, or like on those lines that aren't covered, it can't tell us which one of those lines is more important to be covered, right? So because we have a limited amount of time and we can't spend all of our time just testing, we got to spend some of our time actually building the product. We have to prioritize things, and the code coverage report will not tell you that this util that's used on the settings page that basically nobody ever accesses is not as important as the checkout button. It just can't tell you that. And so as good and useful as code coverage is, because it can't tell you whether something's been covered or whether it was run, it can't tell you whether the thing that was running was operating the way that you wanted it to, and it can't tell you whether it's important to have it covered. So when you're looking at the code, don't think about the ifs and the else and life cycles and whatever else. That's code coverage. Instead, what you should be asking yourself is, what use cases are these lines of code supporting, and what tests can I add to support those use cases? And that's what use case coverage is. Okay, and unfortunately, it just cannot be measured. So let's look at an example here really quick. And this is an example of how focusing on code coverage can actually hide use cases. So we've got this function called arrayify that takes a maybe array. So it could be an array, it could not be. We don't know. We're going to turn it into an array. And I use this often for like utility functions that can take one post or an array of posts, and then it iterates over all those posts. If it's an array, then we'll just return it because it's fine. Otherwise, we'll turn it into an array and return that. So we return an array if given an array. That makes sense, and that covers that that first bit. And then it returns an array of the with the given argument if it's not an array. So we give it a string and we get back an array of that, and that covers this line. And if we looked at our code coverage from just these two tests, we're getting 100% code coverage, right? But we're missing a use case. Anybody want to volunteer what the use case we're missing? Yes. Yes, an empty string, or like any falsy value, right? So if we're just focusing on our code and we're looking at that code coverage report, and as soon as that says we've got 100%, and we're just like, oh, sweet, we're done. You're not done, because there are all sorts of different arguments. Like like a few years ago, I was just lamenting the fact that there's no tool that I'm aware of that can give you data coverage, where it'll tell you all of the different data types or parameters that a function could accept, and tell you whether your tests are covering all of those different data types. That would be really cool. And I feel like that is a tool that actually could be built. So have fun with that. But yeah, we're missing a use case, and it's because we were thinking about the code and we were thinking, okay, here's an if, here's an else. I just need to make sure that my tests run through those. And so if we're thinking about use cases, then we would probably come up with these two tests as well, because those are the use cases. If I pass an array, it just gives me back that same array. If I pass non-array, then it gives me an array with one element of that thing. But then we would also look at this and be like, oh yeah, another use case is if they pass in some falsy value, then we want to just filter that out. And so we would add this test. It returns an empty array if given a falsy value. So nothing gives me back an empty array. And now we've got our use cases. And yes, you could write this function differently. I actually may have, I don't know. I think I would probably write it like that. But this is just an example of like the many different situations that you can find yourself in by focusing on the code and not as much on the use cases. So you want to think about what are the use cases. And in fact, it can be really helpful to, well, yeah, test use cases, not code. Yeah, it was right. Yeah, there it is. I'll talk about what could be really helpful in here in a second. Yeah, so think about use cases, not code. So with React, before React Testing Library, we had Enzyme. How many people used Enzyme, or maybe still use Enzyme? Like you can't just like delete all, well, technically you could, if you wanted to, delete all of those. But no, I wouldn't recommend it. So you may still be running Enzyme tests. And with Enzyme, a lot of the testing was focused on lifecycle methods, event handlers, and internal component state. You'd say, hey, Enzyme, I want to mount this component, and then I'm going to dot state that thing so I can get the state value or check the props on that component. And we're looking at all of this stuff that our end users know nothing about and care nothing about. In fact, as far as they're concerned, we've got a bunch of monkeys in the server room, like typing up HTML and sending it to them when they request our page. It doesn't matter to them as long as it's fast. They're very fast typing monkeys. And we call this one React. And so if our tests start looking into some of these different aspects of our components, then we can, well, now I'm starting to talk a little bit about the implementation details thing, but we can make it so that our test can fail when the component is actually working for the user, or the test can pass when the component's not working for the user, because we're focused on the way that it was implemented and not what the thing is actually doing, not the use case that it was created for. And so that's why I created React Testing Library, was because Enzyme encouraged the types of tests that I'll encourage you to think about these things. So instead of thinking about the internals, we want to think about the two users that are using our component. The developers who are rendering the component or interacting with it in some way, and the end users who are interacting with it. And these are the different interactions that can happen. So when you're thinking, I've got a React component and I want to test, I want to think about all the different ways that this can be used, then these are the 4 ways that I came up with. I don't think there's any other things you need to think about. So just like make a checklist. So user interaction. So what happens when the end user interacts with the elements? They're clicking on things, they're filling out forms, whatever. And testing library user event can help you with that. If the props change, or like the initial render as well. So what the props that are passed, and you can use React Testing Library for that. So what happens if the developer re-renders your component with new props? Your use effects are going to run, or whatever. But it's not the fact that the use effects are going to run. It's the fact that the props changed, and so therefore some side effect is going to occur. And we want to verify that the use case that side effect was written for is going to work. And then context value changes, React Testing Library can help you with this as well. And then subscription changes. So like in your use effect, you're subscribing to a Firebase thing, or some browser-based online status, like whether the network is active or whatever. And so those are the 4 ways that your component can be used by either developers or end users. And you just make a checklist of this thing and just say, I'm covering all of the use cases for the way that my component can be used. Okay, so now where do we start when we're just getting started writing tests for a component or for our entire application? So the way that I say it is, what part of the app would make me most upset if it were broken? Or maybe your users most upset? Or what would be the worst thing to break in the app? Like I was saying earlier, you've got that settings utility that's used by like basically nobody. Only occasionally will somebody go and touch that. It's important that it works when somebody does want to use that feature, but it's not as important as the checkout button on your e-commerce website, or whatever it is you're building. And so what I recommend, especially when you're just getting started, is to sit down with your team and with your product manager and just say, hey, let's make a list of all of the use cases that our app supports. This, maybe not all of them. That would take an extremely long time for any mature application. But make a list and then ask the product manager, which one of these would you be most mad about if it broke, or would be the worst for us, and just prioritize it in that order. And then you start testing from top to bottom. And then, of course, like you can't just stop all development. Well, most of us can't. I don't know. That would be an odd organization that just lets you stop all development until everything's tested. I wouldn't recommend it if you want to stay in business. But it can be really helpful to take some time out of every couple of weeks to look at that list and say, oh, this hasn't been tested yet. Let's add some tests to that. And actually, one thing that can help a lot is most product managers know exactly what really bothers them or freaks them out or keeps them up at night that's not well tested. And so you can say, hey, how would you like to not have to check this every single time we redeploy? Because yeah, lots of product managers do. Like as soon as the deploy happens, they're always going to check that one feature that they're freaked out is going to break. So you can say, hey, just give me a little bit of time and I'll automate that. Now you don't have to check it every time. And then, of course, as you're adding new features and stuff, having tests as like a part of the whole process can help. And by having a meeting with the product manager and your team and talking about like, okay, what would you be most upset about if it were broken? That can kind of kick things off too, to get you on the right foot to start testing things. I also have another blog post about how to add testing to an existing project that you can go look at. And it talks about, should you start with end-to-end tests versus unit tests or integration or whatever. We're not going to get into that today, unless one of you asks during Q&A, I guess. So yeah, about ready to wrap up already. Conclusion here. We'll have lots of time for Q&A. Yeah, here are the key takeaways. Is the whole purpose of writing tests is to be confident that our application is going to work. That's the entire reason we're writing tests, or at least the reason that we run them before we deploy. So I want you to think less about the code you're testing, more about the use cases that code supports, because that will lead you to writing tests that are more resilient to changes and give you more confidence that it will work when the user uses them, because you're thinking about use cases and not code. So code is not as important as use cases. Think about use case coverage, and test use cases, not code. And that is all. I've got a bunch of resources for you. Some that we already mentioned. There's also this talk by Aaron Abramoff, not related to Dan, but actually does work at Facebook. He works on, I don't know what he's doing right now, but he worked on the Jest team. But he and I both spoke at Assert.js 2018, which, wow, that was 3 years ago. Holy moly. COVID like messed up my entire sense of time. Just like, that's so weird. But his talk was really great, establishing testing patterns with software design principles. He talks a lot about why you don't want to have 100% code coverage and what dangers lurk there if you try. So yeah, that's a good one to go look at. And then of course, testingjavascript.com is a pretty good resource too. And that's it. I'm happy to answer your questions. Yeah, do you want to, or should I, or I'm happy to just call on people and stuff.
What's the situation with the testing of your new website? I mean, like, unit integration, visual test, like how far you went with that one?
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you asked. You want to see them? Oh, so many of you are about to be really disappointed. So, and actually, this is a really great discussion topic. So I am legitimately glad that you asked. Where is it? Cypress, there we go. So those are all my tests for my website. To be clear, my website isn't just like your blogfolio type website. It's like user accounts and a bunch of stuff. It's 25,000 lines of code. And I have, like, each one of these, I think, only has one test in it. This one actually is recording audio in the browser and verifying that like audio gets persisted to the database and comes back and even creates a little podcast episode. It's really cool. Like, so end-to-end tests, my end-to-end tests are typically the happy path of a whole user flow, with exception of like creating user account. That's a separate end-to-end test because that like adds a bunch of time on your tests. And so I just do one for user registration. I think I do have one of those, yeah, onboarding. And then I have just like hit the API, create a user, and then go do all this stuff. And so I get a ton of coverage from just a few end-to-end tests. But I also don't measure coverage for end-to-end tests because I feel like it's not impossible, but it is hard. And I don't think it's all that useful anyway, because I'm thinking about use cases anyway. So yeah, I do have some jest tests, but actually those you'll find are mostly in my content directory. These are like blog posts where I'm like talking about testing and I have some code examples. And so I'll put those code examples as actual runnable tests in my project to make sure that those work. And if they ever break, then I can update the blog post. So yeah, I actually don't have, I have one unit test for the whole website right now. So the reason for this is because I actually recommend this for most people. When you're building something for the very first time, you're creating a brand new thing. It's more important to, okay, there are exceptions to this. There's always nuance, but in general, it's more important to ship than to have like an amazing set of tests. So if I decided that I wanted to have unit tests on everything and integration tests and have end-to-end tests on everything, then you wouldn't get this cool new website for another like 2 months. And I'm not prepared to accept that. The other thing is that I actually don't make any money on my website and nobody loses any money if my website's busted. So, I mean, it is a funnel, you know, like it does funnel into all my other stuff, but so it's not a big deal if stuff is busted. And so my website is actually one place where I don't write a whole lot of tests, but my libraries are always 100% code coverage. So feel free to continue trusting my libraries. But yeah, I'm glad that you asked that because there's a lot of nuance with, okay, we're building something brand new. We just want to get it shipped. Let's get it shipped and then we can, and actually the other thing is, especially when you're building something new and you're not exactly sure the shape that it's going to take when you're all done, if you, and I feel the same way about TypeScript too, actually, if you spend all of this time adding type safety, like really awesome types, and you're doing all of these amazing tests, and then you get toward the end of it and you realize, oh, actually, we don't want this feature anymore. It's like the user doesn't care or whatever. It's like, well, all that time was wasted where you might have been able to actually finish it. And then the user finds out they do like it or something. So yeah, when I'm just getting started with something, I pretty much only test it enough so that it's only speeding me up where I don't have to manually check every time. And that's why I actually focus on end-to-end because they're pretty quick to, like I have to be able to run my app locally anyway. And so I just do the same thing for my end-to-end test that I do for my development. And so it's normally not a ton of effort to get set up. And then, yeah, and then I just work on shipping stuff. One other fun fact is I run this in GitHub Actions. I've got this cool deployment pipeline where I run Cypress in 3 different containers. So like my tests are split up across these 3 different containers. But I also have, oh, where is it? Oh, continue on error enabled. So my tests don't actually break CI if they bust, if they fail. It still deploys. And in fact, I don't even wait for the Cypress test to finish before I deploy. So I'm just like, we'll just have them running and then eventually I'll turn it on. But right now I'm moving fast. So anyway, that was probably more of an answer than you were looking for, but that's the answer. The unit test was, basically, I just got to have another install on that library. Yeah. Actually, that's actually a good point. The unit test was only there to get it configured. And so that, and this is actually very important. One of the hardest parts of getting testing started in any project is just getting the tooling set up. And so I recommend getting at least one of each type of test running. Just so that when it is time to, okay, now we're going to get serious about this, you don't have to figure out, oh, well, so your coworker has, an hour of extra time before the day is out, and they're like, you know what, I'll write a test. And then they're like, oh, shoot, I need to configure everything. Never mind. So if you have everything all configured and set up, then yeah, that 1 hour is like, okay, yeah, I can make that happen. So that, yeah, it was just to install the library. Cool. Yeah. The biggest bug I ever shipped to prod?
Like the one that is, I mean, it's about like impacting the big, because
yeah, the biggest
like,
impact.
Running the log view and just doesn't work. But it's like it's available for thousands of people, whatever.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember if this was me. And I think that's the sign of a good, healthy team, is one that doesn't remember who it was that made the mistake. Or maybe I'm just blocking it out of my memory. But at PayPal, we had a terrible out of memory error, and the server would start up and then just immediately shut down, start up and shut down, start. And fire, everybody is trying to figure it out. What it was we took the express object and we sent it to our logging platform, and yeah, that was not good. I don't think that one was me, but it might have been. We created an ESLint rule for that one afterward. One that was for sure me. This wasn't a bug that I caused in production, but it was a bug I reproduced in production. But it was a cross-site scripting bug in our chat. This is not at PayPal. This is at a company called Domo. And the chat was on literally every page. And every page you went to, the chat would load up. And so I got this bug that we had a cross-site scripting problem in there, because we were using Backbone and not React. And so cross-site scripting is like scary. You don't have this dangerously set in your HTML that tells you escape this. So I got the bug and I sat down at my laptop and I was like, well, first step of after you get a bug is to reproduce it, right? So I went and I reproduced it in production, and it's a cross-site scripting bug. What I said was, script alert, you've been hacked. And everybody in the entire company started, like every page they went to, every page, they'd say, oh, alert, you've been hacked. What the freak? And then they'd click on a link, alert, you've been hacked. Like every single page, it was a disaster. And what made it worse was this is a new feature. And so we hadn't implemented delete yet. So I couldn't delete it. And I was like running around to the backend engineers. And I'm just like this. I was still an intern. And I was like, guys, I need you to delete this. And they're like, who are you? And they're like, we've got this real problem dealing with, stop, what is this? So we eventually, like 2 hours later, got it deleted. Luckily, it was just on our internal instance. And so our customers didn't see this. But boy, that was terrifying. Yeah, that was probably the most scary production thing I've ever done. Never dropped a table. And yeah, I've never. Sorry, what?
Only databases.
Yeah. Yeah. I just still deleted the entire prod database. No, yeah, that's probably the worst. So.
Okay, so we have some questions from our online attendees. So let's maybe try to go through them. Mario is asking, what about thinking what happens when an external resource is accessed? For example, API. Should this be included as part of user interactions and subscription changes?
Yeah, okay, so if you're talking about interacting with an external API, and if we're thinking about front end, that's going to happen most likely if you're, all right. So it could be happening in a use effect that you've written yourself. It could be happening inside of React Query. Or if you're using Remix, it's happening in your loader, that's happening on the server. And that's awesome. But wherever it happens actually is not super relevant because that's an implementation detail. And so so long as your testing is configured so that you can render your components within all the providers that they need and whatnot, so that it has a React Query provider, if that's what you're using, then you simply interact with the component the same way that the user would. So let's say that we're making a request to go get the user's cart total or whatever. And so the user adds items to their cart and then they navigate to this page. You make that request. And that's what your test is going to do. It's going to add items to the cart. It's going to go to this page and that request will be made. And it will just happen naturally. Now, if it's an end-to-end test, then you're not going to mock it out. You're going to let that request be made. And then you'll just verify that the cart number says what it should, because that's all the user knows. And that's all that your test should know as well. But if it's if it's like an integration test, then I draw the line on the network boundary. That's where we mock everything on the other side of the network. And so I use MSW for that. It's amazing. And you mock out that request, and then you just make sure that that cart number gets updated with whatever mock value you return. I think that answers the question. Did I? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. One more question from the crowd. Rokas is asking how to come up with good names for test cases.
Ooh, that's a great one. Okay, so good names for test cases. The best names I ever came up for test cases was when I sat down with my product manager at a company called Alianza, and we just finished discussing a feature he wanted me to implement. We went through the different tasks he wanted me to do, and I said, hey, come over here. And I opened up my editor and I said, okay, what does this feature need to do? And he would just start listing them off. And I wrote down what it should do. It should do this, should do that, should do the other thing. And I basically scaffolded out the test. So it's like test, oh, come on. Should do this thing. And then I would say, okay, cool, I'll make it do that thing. And then I said, should do the other thing. Like he was right there and I was typing it out. And those were the best test cases I ever wrote. Because it was exact, and like I so strongly recommend doing this because he could see that I was like really taking it seriously. The feature was going to be good, and then like I was able to ask him, well, what happens about error states? What should it look like if there's an error? Which of course they never give you designs for that. Or the loading state. It's like speed of light is faster than the speed of light or something, and so of course. With Remix, you don't have many loading states. It's amazing. And okay, I'm not going to. Never mind. Remix is just so cool. So I really want to though. So there, with Remix, it doesn't actually navigate you to the next page until that page is ready. And if you like, as I'm hovering over these links, it's actually preloading everything for that next page, including the data on the back end. And so it's ready right away. And there's like, you eliminate so many loading states doing this. And eventually they're going to be even smarter and be like, oh, the mouse is approaching this link, so I will preload that stuff. So cool. And good news for those of you who just like, I don't want to use Remix or whatever. That's kind of weird, but most of this stuff is going into React Router. So if you use React Router, you'll get that. Anyway, what was I even talking about? Oh yeah, test cases. Sorry, I didn't mention this, but I am super jet lagged. I arrived today, and I've had 4 hours in the last like 36. Yeah, so writing good test cases, when you're thinking about use cases, it's easier to write good test cases because you're like, okay, I've got this drop-down component, and when the user mouses or when the user focuses in, it needs to drop down. That's just like the way that this is going to work. That is a use case. User focuses the drop down opens. the user presses the down arrow key, the highlighted item goes down. That's another use case. And so each one of these are use cases. And sometimes I'll find myself combining these into a single test, especially if I'm doing unit tests. It's typically against a pure function that I'm just like sending a bunch of arguments. And so that one's pretty easy. If I'm talking about a React component, that's normally like, integration test isn't the right way to describe this. It's more of like a component test. It's like a different category thing. But I try to, I will often combine use cases into one like general, user goes in and they select this and I assert that it opened up, and then they start typing and I assert the options that are available, and then they hit that down arrow and I assert that so you've got several assertions in one test. Writing a good test case title for that, it's kind of tricky. What I'd probably do is like call it the happy path for the component. And then like because React testing library is just so great, you can kind of read it and you know what's going on. And if there are sections of that where you know what, in fact, I might be able to show you. I haven't maintained downshift in a long time. Anybody here use downshift? Sweet. That's awesome. So it's been a long time since I've used downshift or maintained downshift. I handed it off a long time ago, but let me see. Yeah, I remember like writing these, but I don't have any use cases for it right now. No, I don't. But PayPal still does. So, okay, let me see if I can find. No, this is a bad example. I won't spend too much time on this, but oh, actually, you know what? Item props is probably a good one. No, that is not. Oh, man. Okay, so sometimes I will write a utility. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so sometimes I'll make a special render function, render downshift here, that has like my use case for this file. And then as part of the return, I'll return all the utilities that that React testing library returns when you call render. But then I will also return a bunch of other little utilities that help my tests read a little nicer. And so I'll say, pressing home, the home key on the input, pressing the end key on the input, because we're going like, beginning and ending of the list, arrow down, arrow up, all of that stuff. And so then I can say disabled item can't be highlighted when navigating via home. And there you go. We render our downshift with these items. We say home on input and then enter on input. And that's the value it should have as checkers, I guess, because those were disabled. Yep, that makes sense. So anyway, so the title doesn't matter. Like the title matters, but it doesn't always matter quite as much as the test itself just being readable. And you can do that with some nice utility methods and stuff. So, okay. I can be long-winded. Feel free to interrupt me if you're like, let's get on to the next question.
Yeah, let's get on to the next. Okay, so another question from Mario. What approach are you using for your end-to-end test with Cypress against real API or mocked one? Which one do you find more interesting? If using the latter, how are you mocking the API?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can tell you on my website, I'm interacting with a lot of third-party APIs. For example, the Call Kent podcast, these are all mocked. The API that I'm interacting with for this is a podcast. And so the podcast episodes are hosted on a service called Transistor. They do all the podcast stuff, and I upload the podcast to them. My server does. And then I just query their API. But I don't want my test to rely on a third party. I pretty much never want that. I want to be able to use the third party. Like I want to be able to run my test suite against the third party and have it still work. So like run it manually. But like in CI and stuff, I want third parties mocked because I don't want my CI to fail to deploy if my third party has some issues, because that would be stupid. What I'm doing here is I also want to be able to develop my site offline, completely offline. And so what I have done is I have MSW here, and I can show you actually. Oh, this is kind of fun. I wasn't expecting to show you all this fun code. So I've got this mocks directory. Oh, that's weird. I wanted to bump up the font size and it's not letting me. Huh. Oh, I know why, because we're missing a comma. Thank you. Normally it just adds that for me, but okay. So we have this mocks directory. This start right here gets MSW to start up the server. And I have this run alongside my server. So when I start the server, I think I start it with a node dash require that like says require this file. And so it ends up running this file alongside in the same process with my server. And so because with Remix, almost like most of the time you want the Remix server to be making all the network requests. You don't actually make network requests from the browser, not manually anyway. Remix does that for you, and it can do all sorts of really awesome optimizations, which is one of the reasons why it's so cool. And so I have MSW running on the server, and all of the like ConvertKit and Transistor and Simplecast, because I actually have 2 podcasts on my website, and one of them is with Simplecast, the other's with Transistor. I like Transistor better, but Simplecast is first. So that's why we've got 2. Yeah, and Discord, Twitter, all of that stuff, all mocked out. And so that's how I develop. And so I can run everything completely offline. I can go off into the woods and work offline. And that's just really fun. It's awesome. But because I've done that, I can very easily do the same thing for my end-to-end tests. And that's what I do. When I run the Cypress tests, I set up all these, or I run this alongside my server, and then I don't have to worry about like whether my third parties are accessible or whatever. And I would do the same thing on the client as well. I feel like there was another piece to that question that I've missed.
Like the other part.
Yeah, what was the other part of the question? I know there's.
Which one do you find more interesting? Using the later, how are you mocking the API? The question was like, are you testing against the real API or mocked one?
Yeah.
And then which one do you find more interesting? And
yeah, I think I addressed that. Yeah, I prefer to not be beholden to third-party APIs, but I want to be able to manually run them against the real APIs. Oh, we've got a question in the room here.
yeah, okay, let's mix it.
Okay, so when writing tests, I'm usually thinking about the confidence that we provide.
Yes, about your confidence, so it kind of have 2 parts of this question. So maybe let's begin with the part first. So when talking about these mocked APIs, yeah. So when you're making mocks, so you're kind of using the data structure that kind of was present at that time. And for example, if this API kind of changes with contract on their side, so the tests are kind of passing, but the real product will not be working. So that's kind of an issue I'm seeing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and this is for sure a real issue. There are some API providers that are not very good at versioning their APIs. Surprise, this field is not required. Yeah, or actually I've had one where this actually was my backend team. They ran into this issue where it started failing because they provided an optional thing, and then they I can't remember. They provided more data and it was fine, and then the API provider decided that wasn't fine anymore and just didn't tell anybody. Yeah, so that's fun. Yes, so if you feel like you're at risk of that sort of thing, then testing against the real API is really it's like critical. The big challenge is we mock to make things practical. So if we could, we would just hit like not mock anything and just everything would be real. But there are a few reasons why we don't do that. One, it can be very slow to like, because if we're thinking about testing our software the way that our software is used, then every single test would log in or create a new user account and log in with that user and go through all of these steps to get to that. It's just not really practical. And so we take shortcuts like my login utility here. It hits a special endpoint that is only available locally. You can't hit this in production, so don't try. But if it were available in production, you could literally log in as any user you wanted to. But I've got a lot of protections against this ever getting deployed to production by accident. Yeah, so we take these shortcuts just to make it practical, right? So that it's faster. Or let's say that you're a company and you sell cute koalas. Just like, for example, if you happen to be selling this adorable thing, it's so cute. I have 6 of them because there are 6 kids, 6 people in my family. I got one for each one of us, and it's so cute. That's Cody, by the way. Yeah, so let's say that you're selling these and you want to test to make sure that people can buy them. And so, but you want to make sure that it actually works with the third-party providers. And so you're going to write a Cypress test that will go to your real website, and you're going to say add to cart, and then you'll go click on this and click checkout, and then that's going to direct over here. And so then you'll fill out all the information and check out. Well, now you've got kind of a problem and also like a good thing. So, well, 2 good things. 1, you're super confident that this thing actually works. 2, you've now got like every single time you run this test, you get another koala. Isn't that great? So that's awesome. The bad thing is they cost $17.50 and your credit card will run out fast. So we have to mock. We can't get away from mocking at some point for practicality reasons. So
Can I add something?
yeah.
Also, some APIs, like good APIs, they usually provide like a test kit for them or some kind of a sandbox mode where you can, turn that sandbox on and then, do some shortcuts around some calls.
Yeah,
That's exactly
Stripe does this. Yeah. Yeah, and that's great. Still, though, that is a mock. It's just a mock you don't control, which arguably is better. That is certainly better because if they're going to deploy a change to their real thing, then presumably they'll deploy that same change to the mock. So if you can convince your providers to do that, then yes, that would be awesome. But sans that, we do sometimes have to mock, and we just have to eat that that risk. And that's why, again, I say you want to be able to run against the real API, but in CI, for most use cases, we'll just run against our mocks.
So basically, you are kind of making a trade-off between confidence and kind of usability.
Yep,
right?
exactly. It's all trade-offs. What a disaster.
Yeah, and maybe another question so related to confidence. So one thing is about APIs, but another, for example, in your testing library, you have these user events that kind of mimic what a browser click does.
Yeah.
For example, as an example. But we cannot be sure that the same kind of a code will work on the real browser. For example, on Chrome, it might work, on the Firefox, it won't work, and so on. So it's still, so how can you sleep confidently?
Yeah, yeah. Well, contrary to popular or not popular belief, but it's a common misconception that user event run or that all of testing library code runs only in Jest and JS DOM. It actually runs in the browser. And so you can use all of React testing library in real browsers and you could run it. The only tool that I'm aware of that really does that where it's like a visual browser and everything and supports all the browsers is Karma. But I mean, how many of you have used Karma? Yeah. Yeah, it was a great tool for its time, but it's not widely used, it's not well maintained. So yeah, yeah, Karma, that's right. So yeah, we're not going to make a reference to what it was originally called. Us OGs know that. It's, I mean, there's also Puppeteer, but that'll only get you Chrome. Cypress now runs in, I think Safari is the only one it doesn't run in. But Cypress has its own set of like basically user events, which is way better. Use Cypress for interacting. If you're in Cypress, don't try to use user event, just use the Cypress things. But do use the Cypress testing library queries because they're better too. But yeah, we are making trade-offs by running things in Jest because like it may or may not work in the various browsers. And that's just another one. For me, I run my tests in Jest because they're faster. When you get to where I was at PayPal with thousands of tests, I need to have something that can run, can identify here are all the tests that are relevant for the changes that you made and just run those on pre-commit. Otherwise, I won't run them pre-commit, and then they'll run in CI and break. And I will only know like 20 minutes into my next thing, like, oh shoot, now I got to go back and fix that. So I want it to run locally and I want it to be fast. And so I make the trade-off.
And maybe another question. I guess you're familiar with concept of black box testing and white box testing. So when you know, for some of you, so when you know implementation details and when you do not. So sometimes I'm trying to write tests from a perspective that I do not know how it's implemented internally. And but sometimes you think, oh, I really know that this code cannot kind of break because it does not have any ifs or so on, like I mentioned, implementation details. But sometimes, yeah, if you try to cover all the possible cases, for example, passing all data types and so on. So we, for example, your array5 method, for example, maybe there's some custom if which has a check if it receives some, let's say, string value called break, and it will start not working. So how also you approach this situation?
Yeah, so I don't often use the terms white box and black box testing, but making it up right now, I would say maybe I'm kind of a gray box tester, where I know what the implementation is, and so that gives me ideas of what I need to be thinking about as I'm writing my test. But again, I'm really mostly interested in what are the use cases this code is intended. And actually, one of the reasons why use cases are so vital to when you're writing the test is if you're thinking about the code, then you might look at the function and be like, oh, there's a use case that this supports that I didn't think about it. Like I didn't realize that this would also do this. So I guess I'll write a test for that. But now the only piece of code in your entire code base that cares about that use case is your test. And nobody cares about the test. We all hate the test. And now we've got that test in there and somebody comes around to refactor and they do a refactor and then that test breaks. Like that test only exists for itself. And so it's this is why I just think it's so important to think about use cases and don't think about code, the code that you're actually trying to test, because you can over test it, like I was saying, and then the various other things you can under test it. So yeah, I guess like white box, black box, I guess the understanding the implementation kind of helps guide me on some of the use cases that I may not be remembering or thinking about, I guess. But when I'm actually writing the test, I really don't want to think about how things work inside.
And maybe the last question from me. So
yeah.
About visual testing. So
yeah.
that's, I think, is one of the main difference from a backend testing, because backend kind of has this JSON testing mostly, just call the API and just test with JSON response. And testing with JSON response is quite easy, I would say. And the same with the kind of our
those backend engineers, they got it so easy.
yeah, but from at least this side, and at least in the front-end world, we have a browser which kind of you can have always perfect kind of working test, but for example, your styling can be completely broken, the page can be completely not used. And how are you approaching the situation? So yeah, I know that there are screenshot testings and so on, but they have their own issues.
Yes.
So people are using like 95% accuracy, so that if very small differences that they would not be breaking and similar things. So what's your approach on the visual testing?
Yeah, so I have never gotten around to actually getting visual testing working and running at any company I've been at. It was never a high enough priority for us, but I know Wix has. But I can recommend some tools because I've gotten demos, so take that for what that's worth. But if you're building a component library, then I would not use anything other than Chromatic. Just like Storybook, Chromatic, they're doing some really cool things with integrating with testing library as well. And so like you'll be able to interact and take another snapshot all with Chromatic, and it's all built in. It's very cool. If you're using, you can also look into Percy.io, which I've actually not gotten a demo of that, but people who use it tell me they like it. So there's that. And then Applitools I've gotten a demo of, and that's just like blows my mind how amazing that tool is.
Yeah, Applitools is something we use, but it's quite expensive.
Yes, it's very expensive.
Yeah.
I remember when they told me how much it was, and I was like, whoa. And he was like, what, is that a lot? I was like, yes, that's a lot. And but I guess it's worth it.
This is what made us to build our own.
Oh, that's why you Well, there you go. Actually, anybody heard of the tool Huxley? No. So this is back years ago. Yeah. This was like a homegrown snapshot tool before like Puppeteer was a thing or any of this. And I did get that running at my company Alianza just locally, and I never, because then you have to figure out, okay, well, how do we do this in CI? And that's why there are companies that are built to solve this problem, or like big companies like Wix that have the resources to actually build it. But yes, so like I said, I've never actually, like even at PayPal, and I was working on a component library, we didn't have this in place. It was just, hopefully you catch it before it goes out. And because it's a great deal of effort to get set up, and we just never prioritized it, but I think it's important. So.
Cool. Let's continue with some questions from the chat. Any tips for that's a good one. Any tips for a good question to ask a person to know if he or she is good with testing?
Ooh, like an interview question or something.
Yeah.
I interviewed a lot at PayPal, and I don't remember ever asking any questions about testing, which seems odd to me now. Yeah, okay. My interview style, this may not be the answer you're looking for, but my interview style is, I want you to tell me what you're really good at. Like, what is the thing that you are best at? Like, what have you done that's been really awesome? Tell me all about it. And then I'm going to ask you questions about it, and I'm going to find out what you mean when you say I'm really good at this. So if you say I'm really good at React, then I'm going to ask you all these questions. I'm going to say, hey, can you build me a counter component? And I did this a lot, actually, because a lot of people say, oh, yeah, I'm really good with React. And then I'd say, build a counter component. This is literally like 5 lines of code with hooks. With classes, it was a couple more. And that's when I was interviewing. But like pretty basic thing. You'd be surprised how many people said, oh, yeah, I'm super good with React, and they couldn't build a counter component. Like, I mean, there's the stress of the interview and everything. So you've got to be aware of that. But my interview style is tell me what you're super good at and show me how good you are at it. So yeah, that's probably why I never really asked questions about testing, because nobody ever said I'm super good at testing, I guess. Anyway, to try and actually answer your question, I don't know, I'd probably try to get an understanding of their philosophy about testing. Might ask questions about maybe what implementation details are. I don't know. Like I cringe so hard at those. Like, do you happen to know the definition of this one word, or like in all of your time as a software engineer, did you happen to like wander down this path that I wandered down? And I just don't feel like that is a very good way to get good engineers into your organization. So yeah, I'm not gonna, I don't know. Sorry.
It's a good answer. Okay, do we have more questions?
I've noticed some people like this will pop up and say somebody's raising their hand, but there's nobody on there. We've got like
You said something else. I don't see
yeah,
that.
maybe not.
There's another chat for Q&A.
I'm more than happy to just stand around and talk. Or
no, but that's the, you know, it contains the same questions as we have here. So nothing missing.
We could also just be done, and I'm gonna go pass out in my room. So. But I'm happy to chat. This is why I came here, was to be able to like be with people again. So yeah.
When was the last time you went to the conference?
Oh, I actually was in Croatia 2 weeks ago. So a few months ago, I started getting like people saying, "Hey, we're actually going to do a live thing," and I'm like, "Yes, anything. Where? I will go to the moon." Actually, are you going to the moon? I would. Yes. So and then I'm going to React Advanced in London in 2 weeks. So, and I have 4 kids. My wife is by herself. So say thanks, Brooke. Yeah.
Oh, we have one more question. Do you see TypeScript as one of the essentials to build good apps?
Yes. The spirit of your question was when was the last time, and it was actually ReactConf 2019 in like November. Okay, yeah, TypeScript essential for apps. I would say TypeScript is essential for any app you plan on maintaining. Period. Yep, I've been using TypeScript since, well, at PayPal we were using Flow for a while. That was fun. It was fine. It had really good inference. And we switched over to TypeScript. It was like 2017, I think. So I've been using TypeScript for a long time. And I only recently started switching all of my educational content and open source to TypeScript. My excuse always was for the open source, I didn't want to be another barrier to entry for somebody getting into open source. But then I realized I pretty much required people to write tests anyway, and that's what TypeScript is. It's tests. And so I was like, oh, I'll help people who don't know TypeScript to make a contribution if they need. So I decided to move all that. And then I was talking with Ryan Florence, and he said, yeah, we've moved everything over to TypeScript for our educational stuff. I'm like, well, what about people who don't know TypeScript? And he was like, yeah, like the 2 people who, no, just kidding. There are plenty of people who don't know TypeScript, but he said, if you configure the TypeScript to not be super strict and stuff, then it's actually not a whole lot extra, and people can just not do the typing if they're going through the workshop and they're just like, I don't know TypeScript, I'm just going to skip that part and I'm not going to type my stuff. And you'll maybe get a little underline or something, but it still compiles. It's fine. And so yeah, all of my everything is TypeScript for me now. Unless I'm writing a one-off script, I'll do that in JavaScript. And sometimes when I'm just like experimenting with stuff and playing around with it, I'll do this in a separate file and just do all JavaScript and iterate, then move it over to TypeScript. But yeah, anything you plan on maintaining should be TypeScript.
One more.
Yeah.
A little bit of topic on the testing, but just interested. Talking about React and all that stuff. What do you think about web components?
Web components. I think that it's just such a shame that they turned out the way that they did. They promised so much and delivered so little. They are, I mean, they can still be useful for like video players and stuff like that, low level stuff that you want anybody to be able to use. But like you can't server render them. You can't, there are so many issues. They prefer inheritance over composition. Yeah, there are just a lot of mistakes that were made. Sorry?
No future?
No future? No, they have a small future. They will always be a part of the web platform. They're standardized. And I can see them being useful for companies where they don't mandate a framework. And so they have to support many frameworks. And so a component library of accessible components that are built in web components, I could see them being useful in that situation. But at PayPal, it was just so much, the end result is so much better when you write the component in, most of the time, it's so much better when you write the component in the framework that people are going to consume it in. And so that's why when the last thing that I did at PayPal was get their component library started. They had a couple that were like kind of going at the time, but I got like an official one with the web infra team going, and then I said, here you go, goodbye. And they're still using it. So, and it was just, I was this close to actually convincing them to use CSS and JS for it. And they said, you know what, we've got other teams who are using non-React stuff. They need to be able to use this. So we used regular classes and style sheets. I'm really glad that we decided to do that because it made it possible for other people to use at least the styles. But I can't imagine building that big component library with web components. Just the API for it is really tricky, especially when integrating with React, which is arguably React's problem. But yeah, it's a sad topic for me because I feel like it was a really awesome opportunity and it got messed up. Yeah. Ooh, web development in 5 years. So you want my honest answer? I'm not sure about 5 years, but like in the next decade. Can I go with that? In the next, like, sometime in the next decade, we will be doing drastically different stuff. I don't know what, but what we're doing now will be done by robots. I'm convinced. And so this is why I often say React is the last UI framework you need to learn, because nobody's going to topple React before the robots topple everything. I'm really convinced of this. So I don't know what we will be doing. I'm sure we'll be doing something. This isn't like, no, get out of web dev. Like, robots will be doing everything. So like, what are you going out of the pot into the frying pan? Like, I don't know. But I'm convinced that React will remain relevant until nothing is, basically. So yeah, that's it.
Okay, let's
let's end on that one.
One last
yeah,
question.
One that's maybe more positive.
What's your takeaway on snapshot tests? And
Ooh, yeah.
How did it fit into the use case?
Yeah, great question about snapshot testing. I have a blog post about this, about effective snapshot tests. I very rarely use snapshots. The thing is that the user doesn't care what the DOM looks like. The accessibility tools do sometimes in some situations, but they don't care about all of the spans and divs and everything else. So the problem with snapshots that I'm sure anybody who has used them in real environment runs into very quickly is the snapshot can be really big. And so any change to the component will make a change in the snapshot. Sometimes that change is really big, especially if it's a white space. You wrap everything in div. Now everything's different. And so what happens is the reviewers, the person who made the change in the first place, as well as the people reviewing the change, will just ignore the snapshot and just assume it's correct. And so those types of tests are actually worse than no tests at all, because they make you think that you don't need tests, but you do. Because the test that you have is not giving you confidence. And so it would be better to have no tests, because then you feel like, oh, I gotta have tests. But because you have snapshot tests, you don't feel like you need them when you actually do. So yeah, snapshots, I use them mostly for error messages, actually. I use them quite a bit for that. So I will say, okay, do this thing that'll trigger an error, then go get the error div or whatever, and take a snapshot of what's inside it. That typically works out pretty well most of the time. And other situations, I will sometimes use it. Actually, I use it a lot, or I used to use it a lot when I was doing code transformations with Babel, like custom Babel plugins. I wrote this Babel plugin tester tool that you would give it your source code, and it would take a snapshot that showed the source and then a bunch of arrows, emoji arrows, and then the compiled version. It was really cool. I mean, it still is cool. I just don't use it. I don't write Babel plugins anymore. But yeah, so like that's another good one. Also CLI tools, like output from CLI tools. That's also a really good use case for snapshots. But for UI, I really don't use it very often. Yeah. Actually, one other really good use case for them is during development, when you're going to refactor something, like a big, huge refactor of something, you don't want any of the output to change, then start by taking a snapshot, do all your refactoring, and then keep going until the snapshot is the same, and then delete that test. So, and actually, one other thing, if you are going to use a snapshot, just like a year or two ago, released a two-match inline snapshot where it will put the snapshot in like a string inside of the function call rather than in a separate file. Do that because it will reduce the likelihood that you'll end up with a like 5,000 line snapshot file. Because if it's that long, then it bothers you in your test. If it's in a separate file, it doesn't bother you as much. So.
Well, sometimes I think there's a need to, or a desire to have a lot of specific assertions, like, 6 just expects of text strings. So no alternative to just take a snapshot. Yeah, so what you could do, like if all of those are in the same area of the DOM, then sure, snapshot that. Like it's probably not very big. Another alternative is you could query all of those elements, and then you could put their text content in an object. So here's like the welcome message, here's the subtitle, here's whatever in this object, and then you snapshot that.
Okay, so I guess that's it.
Thanks
you
for
the talk. Let's give a round of applause. So thanks again, Kent. Thanks everyone for coming, and see you in next meetups, hopefully.
Yay.
See ya.
Thank you.